Good evening, and welcome to Seven Stories Up, Carl Siciliano with Paul Elie, Making Room, 3 decades of fighting for beds, belonging, and a safe place for LGBTQ youth. We are delighted to have you all joining us tonight at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. My name is Rachel Crook, and I am an adult services librarian here at SNFL. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making programs like this evening's conversation possible. I would like to encourage you to visit NYPL's website and take a look at the upcoming programs like this one. We have an excellent lineup this season featuring new nonfiction, music, and more. We would love for you to join us in this space again. I would also like to note that today is Transgender Day of Remembrance, an annual observance that honors the memory of transgender people whose lives have been lost in acts of anti-transgender violence. Tonight we honor not only the life of Ali Forney, but many others who were refused the right to continue through their life with the dignity and humanity that they deserved. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Paul Elie is a senior fellow in Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and a regular contributor to The New Yorker. He is the author of The Life You Save May Be Your Own, published in 2003, and Reinventing Bach, which was published in 2012, both National Critics Circle Award finalists. His third book, The Last Supper, about the arts, religion, and controversies in the 1980s, will be published in 2025. Carl Siciliano is a nationally recognized advocate and provider for homeless LGBTQ youth. In 2002, Siciliano founded the Ali Forney Center, the AFC, which has grown to become the nation's largest and most comprehensive housing program for homeless LGBTQ youth. His work has been featured by NPR, CNN, The Daily Show, and New York Magazine. His writing has appeared in HuffPost, The Advocate, and The New York Times. It's now my pleasure to welcome tonight's guest to the stage.
Hello, I'm Paul Elie.
And I'm Carl Siciliano.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's a real privilege to be here, and for a whole bunch of reasons, but to begin with, because this book has done what certain books do, which is enable us to get to know an author and a whole life that is not ours with real depth and integrity very swiftly. Carl, you and I met when I spent 4 or 5 weeks at the Catholic Worker in the late 80s. We fell out of touch. We got back in touch. I reached out to you in connection with the book that I was writing. And then lo and behold, here was this book. And through it, I've gotten to know you in a way that I wouldn't have expected, and know you, I want to say, better than I might have by other means. And that's the sign of a real book, that we're here together talking, but the Carl Siciliano that I encountered in this book is alive and complex in a way that the great nonfiction protagonists are. So thank you so much for the book, and then thanks for the invitation to continue that encounter with you here tonight.
Well, thank you, Paul. And I just want to say how honored I am to have a discussion with you. You're one of my all-time favorite authors. Paul wrote a really remarkable book about 4 prominent Catholic folks, Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, Walker Percy, and Flannery O'Connor. Dorothy and Thomas Merton were hugely inspirational to me, kind of really pushed me on my way. You also wrote an article in The New Yorker about 5 years ago about the sex abuse scandals that I thought was one of the most remarkably excellent and probing and challenging pieces of journalism I've ever read. And so I sort of have awe for you for doing that. So I'm just very honored that I'm able to discuss my book with such a great author.
Well, thanks for that latter, especially because that piece, which ran in The New Yorker at about 12,000 words, it was an incredible opportunity to do. I would say that it didn't have seismic impact. I mean, basically, by the point that my piece came out, it was understood that the church had handled clerical sexual abuse in a criminal way. I didn't have news to bring so much as an effort to kind of pull all the pieces together. And so I've really not known how it's affected people, and the fact that it's affected you really means a lot to me. There's so many things to discuss just in this short conversation, but I want to begin, before Carl reads a passage, just by emphasizing how fully a book this is. I have read so many books. I'm sent books all the time. Many books that I was sent when we were working at Fairstrasse and Giroux, we'd call them ooks. They weren't real books, you know. But then you read a book that's really alive. It's the writer has a voice, a point of view. You can feel the writer, the protagonist, changing in the course of the book. It intersects with other lives, with the life of our time, with big issues, always going deeper and not just becoming a platform for opinions on this or that issue. And I can't say enough good things about this book. I just want to say what I said on the cover, because I think that'll be a good way to introduce the reading that you're going to do. The key to Carl Siciliano's candid, artful, soul-altering book, I think, is that it makes room for the reader. We are right there with him as he faces challenges such as few of us will have to face. We see what he sees, feel what he feels, believe what he believes, and are changed by the experience. I know I was. So with that in mind, I'm hoping that you'll take us into the action of the book and make room for us by reading a scene aloud. And we both know which one you plan to read, and I think it's going to have that kind of effect.
I'm sorry, I think I'm going to mar my beauty by putting glasses on. I hope y'all don't suffer too much. So when I was talking to Paul about, his take on the book before, in preparation for today, he said that like a primary way that he responded to the book was as kind of a conversion within a conversion, like a second conversion. And there's a moment in the book which I see as kind of the core of how that gets expressed in this book, a real moment of challenge and transformation for me. And I wanted to read that. It's a chapter called Eyes to See. And just to prepare for it, I'm always struck by the things we don't see in this world. Like terrible evils can happen, and there can be a kind of collective blindness to it. I imagine being a Catholic priest in like the Jim Crow South. I'm sure people were coming to confession and confessing like masturbation and like lusting after their neighbors' wives and stuff. And I kind of doubt that people were confessing, that black people couldn't drink from the same water fountain or go to the same school. There was just this force field of blindness. And when I first started working with homeless queer youth, I felt that there was this force field of blindness. Like there were hundreds, if not thousands, of queer kids suffering in the streets of our city. The city officials were not able to see them. The parents weren't able to see the worth and the value of their own children that they had thrown away and discarded. And even the queer community, to be honest, wasn't really able to see these young people. Like their lives didn't fit into the kind of narratives that we wanted to tell ourselves about what it meant to come out and be queer. And so this chapter is called Eyes to See, and it's kind of about the opening of my eyes and thinking about what the ethical and spiritual consequences of that opening would be. So that's what I'm going to read here. I think I'm going to cut out the humorous part because I'm a little worried this is just going to go on too long. So I was running a drop-in center called Safe Space. I was the director of this drop-in center for homeless kids. It was in Times Square. It was a time when there was no safe shelter for LGBT youth in New York City. And Heather, you can take pictures of me when I don't have my glasses on. One of the characters of the book is sitting there, like, filming me. Heather Gay. There was no safe shelter. I had gone to my bosses and said, we have to provide safe shelter. These kids are getting murdered in the streets. My bosses weren't interested. I'd gone to the city and said, we have to provide safe shelter. The city looked at me like I was crazy. The LGBT kids were especially suffering. They would get beaten and brutalized when they tried to sleep in shelters and were largely stranded out in the streets. So that's kind of the context that we were in as this scene takes place. And basically, it's about a trip to the beach that we took our young people on. On a bright, hot, early summer day, we closed Safe Space, hoping to provide our kids with a day of fun. Our group of some 60 staff and young people gathered that morning in front of the drop-in center, in the shadows of the large Gothic facade of St. Mary the Virgin. Then we filed a half block to the Times Square subway station and embarked upon the long journey to Coney Island. An hour later, we emerged into the brilliant sunlight and found ourselves as a spot on the beach. As soon as we'd stripped down to our bathing suits, some of the kids asked me to join them in the sea. As we walked towards the water, they all started shouting, "David Hasselhoff," at me. David Hasselhoff having dethroned Jean-Claude Van Damme as the favored muscular white man of comparison. On my first day at Safe Space, Ali's best friend said that I was the sexiest white man alive, except for Jean-Claude Van Damme. So that's why I bring that up here. Obviously, that was a while ago. Don't laugh. They wanted me to run in and out of the waves in exaggerated slow motion, like I was on Baywatch. Complying with their wishes, I ran into the waters as though trudging through quicksand, a dozen giggling teens all running slowly beside me. A raging battle ensued, with 4 of us ferociously splashing one another. George Santana, our rotund outreach worker, and Chuleta, an amiable, big-boned Puerto Rican kid, squared off against me and James Burke, a shy and quiet young black man who tended to sheepishly attach himself to me like a sibling seeking the protection of his older brother. Our splash battle was a scene of uncontained bliss. Streams of water shot furiously in every direction, encircling us with reflected sunlight like chaotic halos. Finally, exhausted from our aquatic combat, we rejoined the rest of our group on the beach for a picnic lunch. We'd brought coolers stocked with sandwiches and fruit drinks. Everyone ate, and as the afternoon wore on, the kids and staff began to peel away. By the time the setting sun stretched our shadows across the beach, only a dozen of us remained. Me, 1 other staff member, and 10 youths. I had been wanting to take them on the amusement park rides, but was obligated to wait until the group was small enough for our miserly budget. We split into 2 groups, some setting off for the go-karts, and the rest of us going on the rickety old Cyclone roller coaster. Usually Ali remained close to me in scenarios like this. However, James Burke was still following me like my shadow, and I suspect that Ali, recognizing James's need, saw fit to make room. James had close-cropped hair and a shy smile. He seemed on the verge of being mute. It was difficult for him to say much more than yes or no. But James was gifted with a friendly, companionable quality. He always seemed so completely happy to be in your presence that you just had to like him. James sat next to me as we were bolted into our cyclone seats. I shouted with excitement as the coaster plunged down its first terrifying descent, while James silently grabbed my arm, a wide smile plastered on his face. When the roller coaster was done rumbling and tossing us about, our two groups reconvened for a ride in the bumper cars. Finally, as we headed to the subway in the last bluish remnant of the day's fading light. Our train left Coney Island, passed Brighton Beach, and descended into the darkness of the underground tunnel. The group now consisted of 4 youths and 1 baby, Ali and James Burke, as well as a young man named Ricardo with the towering height of a basketball player, and a young woman, Milagro, with her baby, Precious Jewel. Such a sweet name for this child born into homelessness. The youths all sat together opposite me in the subway car's L-shaped seating arrangement. I watched them take turns holding Precious in their laps, covering their faces with their hands, crying out peekaboo until the baby burst out laughing. It was an endearing sight. There is a numbing effect that happens when you are regularly submerged in trauma and tragedy. We have a psychological need to normalize our situation, to anesthetize ourselves from the intensity of what we're experiencing. It must be like that for soldiers in combat zones or medical practitioners in inner-city emergency rooms. You need to hold yourself back from being swallowed alive. You need to keep yourself from being swallowed alive, so emotionally you hold yourself back. After 2 years of witnessing our youth struggle to survive in the streets, seeing them show up battered and bloodied after being assaulted in shelters and on the stroll, witnessing their incarcerations, their HIV diagnoses, their arrests, I was beginning to numb myself to their conditions. The city refused to provide housing, and my superiors weren't much different. I felt helpless to bring about any substantial change, exhausted from being enraged and terrified all the time. I started telling myself that the kids' homelessness was an unalterable fact of life. The only way to cope was to accept the unacceptable. But something about that beach day, about jumping in waves and riding in bumper cars, tore at my numbness. In an environment where we were not enacting the rituals of homeless services, our young people were the same as any other kids having a day at the beach. Now watching them play so sweetly with Precious, I began to tremble at the sheer intimacy and protectiveness I felt toward them. As I looked at Ali, James, Milagro, and Ricardo, I saw that each one of them was precious, not just the baby passed from lap to lap. In the core of their beings, beneath their surface behaviors and various coping strategies, I saw that each of them was utterly good. My eyes felt opened in an almost mystical way. It didn't feel like an overtly spiritual speculation. It was more like I glimpsed what was in front of me clearly, without the veils of distraction or the thousands of self-justifying thoughts that usually fogged my vision. I saw Ali, James, Ricardo, Milagro, and Precious Jewel with an immediate graced clarity. And in that seeing, I knew them to be infinitely beloved. But as we reached downtown Brooklyn and I prepared to transfer trains, I felt an increasing sense of dread. I would leave them and head home to Williamsburg, where I was awaited by someone I loved, and a meal of warm tortellini and a cold beer. I would collapse on a couch in front of a TV, surrounded by statues and holy images of Saint Therese and my other favorite saints. The night awaiting these kids had no such comforts. Milagro and Precious would be relatively safe in a shelter for mothers and infants, But what sorts of terrors and humiliations were in store for Ricardo, James, and Ali, who would be riding the trains all night or sleeping on park benches or in crack houses? I took one final look at my companions and felt overwhelmed by the danger they were in. As I stood to exit the subway car, I called out, "Good night, be safe, I'll see you tomorrow." James Burke beamed a big smile, and Ali said, "Thanks, Carl, we had fun today." Waiting for the G train, I sat down and buried my head in my hands. My body still smelled of the beach, of the sand and salt water from our day of innocent fun. My first thought took the form of prayer. Dear God, what am I supposed to do after what I've just seen? How can I go home every night and send them out to the streets? Then the monologue turned inward. Carl, what would you do if they were your children out on their own in this dangerous hell pit of a city? Or even if your puppy or your parrot were lost in the streets? You wouldn't sleep. You'd be in a frenzy, running through the streets like a madman, crying out for them with all your might. You'd be papering the city with posters of their faces. You'd be offering every dollar you have for their safe return home. And yet, is it possible to sustain frenzy every night of your life? How do you summon the same desperation for hundreds upon hundreds of abandoned kids, most of whom you will never even know? How do you create a boundary between a bottomless hole of suffering and your small, finite self? I didn't have the first beginnings of an answer. How do you behold such a vision and keep your sanity? How do you see the face of God and live? I apologize for my grandiosity.
I wouldn't call it grandiosity. I'd call it audacity. And I think you don't live the life you've led or write the book you've written without a certain amount of audacity. Speaking of audacious, when we were in the green room together a few minutes ago, we were talking about Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk and autobiographer, and Carl and I share a deep commitment to his work. And you likened that episode, the one you just read, to the famous Fourth and Walnut episode in Merton's own life. Can you explain what happened to Merton in Fourth and Walnut, and then explain how you see what happened in that excursion to the beach in similar terms, and just draw that connection for us?
So, assuming that most folks in this room are not Merton aficionados, Thomas Merton is a very famous author who was a Roman Catholic monk. He converted to Catholicism in the 1930s and entered a very strict Trappist monastery where they lived this life of silence that was kind of like a medieval life in modern times. And initially he was very focused on this notion of this kind of separate life away from the world. You know, like he was in the holy zone, and then the evil world was out there. And one day in the late 50s, he had to go to Louisville, Kentucky, which was near his monastery. And
for a doctor's appointment or something.
Yeah. And he was standing at a street corner, I think, after the appointment, waiting to be picked up by whoever was going to drive him back to the monastery. And he suddenly saw it was like the light of God shining in all the people around him. And he said something like, it was like waking up from a dream of separateness and realizing his innate connection with all of these people. He said that, if we could ever, it would be amazing if everybody could see this. It's like, because it would be like the gates of heaven opening up. He said the problem would be that we'd all be like falling down and worshiping each other because we would be so amazed. So I kind of feel like what happened to me in the subway was also this kind of awakening to a sense of the radical belovedness of the young people in my care, of you know, their precious worth. There's something different, though, about my experience in Merton's. Merton was looking at strangers, like people he didn't know. You know, he saw it, he went home and wrote about it in his journal. I mean, it was transformative for him, because after that, he stopped just writing about spiritual matters and started writing about the civil rights movement and about nonviolence and about resistance to the Vietnam War, and was sort of like a spiritual guide for kind of left-wing Catholics in the 60s and beyond. But I was seeing kids that I was responsible for, you know, so it was very challenging and very disturbing, and you know, I felt traumatized by it.
Because of the reversal of values, I guess you saw yourself as being responsible for them, and suddenly you feel awakened and emboldened and connected to the source of things by them, which is the opposite of being their caretakers or whatever.
Something that I think I deal with throughout the book is kind of a sense of dread and guilt and anguish, even at just the reality of inequality. Like, you know, what does it mean for me to go home and sleep in my bed when these kids are sleeping in the streets? You know, like, how do you deal with that? How do you cope with that? I think all of us who do the work have to wrestle with those things. You know, I remember reading St. Francis was a saint that inspired me a lot. And he, like they said that in an early biography, they said, you know, he couldn't bear to meet somebody poorer than him. Now, his answer to that was to, like, make sure he had nothing. You know, he just had some holy old raggedy robe and no belongings. I don't know that was my response, but there is something dreadful about being confronted with the suffering of others, with people being persecuted and hurt. And LGBT youth at that time were treated like the wretched of the earth, like the bottom of the barrel, like they were of no human value whatsoever. And it was a dreadful, grievous experience to try to work through that.
And so, and I'll let this episode go in a moment, but so the people for whom you felt such love in that train car that day, it was powerful in itself, but all the more so because they're the people most despised in society at that moment, or among the most at that moment. Isn't that right?
Yeah, and I mean, just really concretely, you know, I was in the subway ride with these Ali, Precious, Milagro, James, and Ricardo. I mean, within a year, Ricardo and Ali would be murdered in the streets. You know, and then about 6 months after that, James Burke aged out of our program. It was just dreadful when he aged out. He stood across the street from our drop-in center and sucked his thumbs and looked up at my windows for 3 days. I had a real strong sense of having failed these young people. You know, that was something that I had to really wrestle with and continue to wrestle with.
So here we are. Carl's mentioning St. Francis of Assisi, and I'm mentioning Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker come into the story. And you said to me a couple of days ago that in important ways the Catholic worker tradition gave you eyes to see with. And yet there's something very disturbing about that, because by your account, institutional religion is the source of so much of the hatred that bears down on these young people. How do those two things fit together?
Yeah, I kind of feel like that's the great paradox of my life, and it's a paradox that I wrestle with throughout the book. For those of you who don't know, the Catholic worker movement was started by Dorothy Day in the 1930s. It was kind of these radical left-wing Catholics trying to put the most demanding teachings of Christ into practice, to dispossess yourself, share what you have with the poor, to live a life of peace and nonviolence and welcoming people who are suffering and dispossessed. And that was how I spent I didn't go to college. I went to the Catholic Worker, and that was my college. I lived between the time that I was 18 and 22 in 3 different Catholic worker houses. Knew a lot of people that were very close to Dorothy, who had died just a few years. I actually found out about the Catholic worker movement by reading her obituary in 1980. And the Catholic worker movement was so centered in the notion of it is our kind of divine obligation to welcome the one who is suffering, to house the one who is homeless, to feed the one who is hungry. That when I started working with homeless youth and was working with an organization that wasn't interested in housing the kids, and the partner organizations that we were working with were also not interested in housing the young people, that was part of the force field. Even the service providers, the force field of blindness I talked about, even the service providers weren't seeing what needed to be done. And I felt that it was my grounding in the Catholic worker movement that made it so crystal clear to me that we had an obligation to provide safe housing for these young people. So, I feel like it's very paradoxical that I got that from my spiritual background as a Catholic. And yet, if you talk to young people that are queer and homeless about why they're queer and homeless, overwhelmingly, it's the religious beliefs of their parents that drive them from their homes. I was hearing these stories so frequently from the young people at the Ali Forney Center that I actually had them build it into our data collection, because it seemed to me that well more than half of the young people were saying this. And, not everybody becomes homeless because their parents kick them out. I mean, sometimes it has more to do with just poverty, racism, parents having substance abuse issues, mental health issues, young people having substance abuse or mental health issues. But the reason that LGBT youth are so disproportionately homeless is overwhelmingly because of familial rejection, parental rejection. And when we ask the young people why they were rejected, overwhelmingly, they say it's the religious beliefs of their families. So, I feel like I have to walk through this paradox throughout all the time that I was doing this, of being inspired to do the work and having kind of a vision of what to do because of my spiritual background, and yet having the torture of seeing that spiritual background being what was hurting the kids in my care.
It's heartbreaking to hear, and I'm glad that you're not stinting on it, because the overwhelming factor you said is a religious situation in the home that makes these kids homeless. Wow. And then I hear a whole historic arc in what you're saying. I mean, Dorothy Day founded the Catholic Worker in the 30s to eventually to offer hospitality to people at a desperate time in the life of this country. When you went to the Worker in the early 80s, the Reagan administration had made a foundational principle the idea that we are not obligated to provide hospitality or anything else to other people, that it's every man for himself. And now, in 2024, a huge part of the population is dead set against any kind of hospitality, to the extent that not only are we told that we don't owe hospitality or oughtn't to practice that, but there's a hatred of the people who might expect our hospitality. I mean, migrants and refugees. How can this be that this thing to which you've devoted your life is so difficult generation after generation? What is it? Any ideas there?
The devil, probably. A lot of the book is about coming to know Ali Forney. Ali Forney was a black, I say now non-binary, although that language wasn't so much in effect in the 80s and 90s when Ali was suffering homelessness. Ali would self-describe as a man in a dress and a wig. But I walked into a situation where, as I said before, I was just amongst young people who were treated as the wretched of the earth, who were seen as without value, who were treated with contempt. I think that there is something in us. In the book, I talk about original sin at one point. And I say that I don't see it like St. Augustine does, as being rooted in sex, which is something that's very strong in the Catholic tradition. But there's this grappling of like, why do we hurt one another so badly? What's wrong with us? Like, what is it about humanity that can elect a Donald Trump twice? Apologies to whatever Trump lovers might be in this room. How can we have a president who comes to power with ads mocking and vilifying and targeting transgender people? What is this need that we have to segregate human beings into like who is us then is acceptable and who is them and not? And what I say in the book is that I feel that if there is something that is damaged in humanity, it doesn't have to do with sex, I don't think. I think it has to do with our need when we have power to exploit and denigrate and show contempt to people that don't have power. And I don't think that's ever going to stop. I think it's going to continue to take new forms. I think that those of us who are trying to live decent lives are always going to have to resist that and fight that and stand up against that. What was so amazing for me personally was just getting to know Ali, because Ali was in the middle of all of that, had been terribly hurt and abused by their family, by the foster care system, by the negligence and cruelty of the city, by the brutality of homophobes and transphobes who, would threaten and attack Ali. Was just like right there at ground zero of being exposed to human hatred and contempt on a daily basis. And yet Ali found it within themselves to day after day after day advocate for and love the other young people. And so to me, that's the antidote. The antidote is to see value in people that our society refuses to see value in, and do the concrete work of love, and figure out in each context, like, what does that mean? I write in the book about something very specific that Ali did that was so inspiring to me. The drop-in center that I was running was in Times Square. We were on 46th Street, just off of Times Square, just a few blocks from here. And in the 90s, there was this huge gentrification that was going on. Like everybody was saying Times Square was being cleaned up, which basically meant our young people who survived through sex work and drug dealing were the dirt. And the police would swarm in at night from multiple directions and just round up everybody who was engaged in sex work or drug dealing. And those were the street economies that homeless kids needed to survive. They were all getting arrested all the time and being driven out to other neighborhoods. And as they were being driven out to other neighborhoods, the transgender youth were especially vulnerable. Were going to do sex work in neighborhoods where there hadn't been as much kind of understanding of who they were. And every couple of months, one of our trans youth were getting killed in the streets. And the police would never investigate these murders. You know, it was, I don't think one transgender woman in New York who was murdered in the 90s, from Marsha Johnson to Ali Forney to everybody else, ever had their murders solved. And Ali would go into these precincts where the murders had happened and demand that they investigate the murders, demand that they treat these homeless transgender women like their lives had value. And I was just so awed when I heard that. You know, for like a black non-binary youth, very feminine, like to go into these hyper-masculine settings. It was, and Ali had like the biggest arrest record you could imagine. Ali was arrested like 40 times in the 2 years prior to their murder as these sweeps in Times Square were happening. And yet that they could do that. And you know, it's kind of wild because when I was writing the book, I didn't know that there were eyewitnesses other than the police. But recently, I was on a panel with some folks that had known Ali, and Ali's therapist, Kate Muldowney, who's in the book, would talk to Ali about the dangers, like counseling him basically against doing it, you know, and was just amazed that Ali had the courage to do it. And one of my coworkers, a man named Bill Torres, actually accompanied Ali once on one of these missions because he was afraid that Ali was putting himself at risk. And, you know, I didn't hear about this until after I'd written the book, but Bill went with Ali and said that Ali, here's what Bill said. He said, Ali read them to filth for ignoring these murders. And Bill said to me that, like, you know, it taught him so much about what it means to be queer, what it means to love one's community, what it means to be a person of justice and decency. And so, yeah, I think that there's terrible evil in this world. And I think that we human beings continue to perpetuate it, but I also think we have the capacity for remarkable goodness. And I am very grateful that I got to know Ali and to see that goodness in practice. Sorry for such a long-winded answer.
No, by all means. So you, and we'll go to questions in a minute, but so you were changed by Ali, and then presumably part of your goal with the book is to witness, but also to embolden and help change minds. I know you've written the book for part because you've been so moved by certain spiritual autobiographies. What's your hope or your objective with the book? What did you hope to achieve by writing it and having it published?
Couple things. On a real basic emotional level, when Ali was murdered, when these kids would be murdered, it was like they would just vanish. Like nobody would,
like trash, no worth to that life.
Like swept away. Like the city, the media, like nobody would treat it like it had any import. And it would be like they had never lived. You know, we'd have these little memorial services for the murdered kids, and 6 or 7 people would show up, and then that was it. I couldn't bear for that to happen to Ali. Like, I needed Ali's name and Ali's memory and Ali's example and witness to carry forward. You know, a big piece of doing that was to do the Ali Forney Center. And for years, I would give speeches about Ali, but I would usually have like 2 or 3 minutes, you know? And I never felt like I was able to get into the meat and the depth and the complexity of who Ali was. And so that was a big part of writing the book. I love Ali, I honor Ali, and I wanted Ali's remarkableness to be given the expression that it deserved. and I don't know that I'm able to do that, but I tried. I also think about myself when I was a teenager. Like, I grew up in a very affluent suburbs of New York, in Westchester County and in Fairfield County, Connecticut. And, all that was presented to me as basically being worthy in life was, materialistic goals, to be wealthy, to be powerful. And I knew that was like a prison. Like, I wanted a different way of being alive. And people's narratives of how they broke free from that, how they were able to live lives of truth, of compassion, of justice, were so important to me when I was a teenager. So I wanted to write one of those narratives. I wanted to write a narrative of, like, how to achieve liberation in this world, how to break out of our prisons of selfishness and self-absorption, and live a life that brings about greater justice, greater compassion, and greater truth. And I felt that Ali did that, and I feel like, my life since has been sort of like unfolding, what I saw within Ali into action. So yeah, I just, I think about, like, Walden by Thoreau, like, just rocked my world, gave me a sense of, like, a different way of living. The Seven-Story Mountain by Thomas Merton, or the autobiography of Malcolm X, or all these things that I read when I was a teenager would just opened up paths for me. And I don't know that can think of, like, a queer book so much like that, or I'm sure there are, but there wasn't one that really came to mind. So I wanted to give a queer voice to that kind of quest for liberation, truth, and compassion.
You mentioned being a teenager. Do you have any response from teenagers who are reading the book, either just teenagers in general, or LGBTQ homeless youth, or what kind of impact is it having among those people?
A lot of the youth at the I did a reading for the youth at the Ali Forney Center, which was very sweet and moving. It was kind of wild because, like, at one point they thanked me for doing this and stood up and gave me a standing ovation, and I thought I was going to cry. But I haven't yet heard from them that they finished the book. I gave it to a lot of them and signed it for a lot of them. I kind of feel like the readers that have reached out to me the most have been queer Catholics. Ranging from their 20s to their 60s or 70s. That seems to be the first audience that has really, that they're the ones who are writing me fan letters.
And what are they saying?
That my book struck a chord in their heart and in their soul. That I'm a saint, which is embarrassing, and not true. I don't know. They thanked me for writing it because they said they've never really read anything like that goes so deep into kind of the intersecting identities of queerness and Christianity, and shows how to live a life wrestling with those intersections.
I've never read anything like that. That's probably the best praise that an author can get, because the power of this kind of writing is that, for various reasons, means of production and economy of scale, you can really make a new thing, and they don't have to match a formula. And you've done something new with this book. You've written something that I hadn't read before. Are there questions or comments from people in the audience?
Before we get any questions, I just want to say that two of my cherished coworkers, Heather Gay and Corby Serrano, are in the audience. When people say that I'm a saint, like, they should actually say it to them. Corby ran our drop-in center and our housing programs for many years, and Heather was our deputy executive director for the longest time. And Corby's now on our board of directors. So, but I'm happy to hear questions.
I know a question that I've had, which is just, at one point were you deciding to write a book and you would go home from the center and write at night? How do you do that?
Well, it took me 7 years to write the book, partly because it's not easy to be an executive director and write a book at the same time, because you're rather busy. I would get up in the morning and write a little bit before I'd go to work. I would write on my lunch break. I didn't take any, my vacations for 5 of those years. I didn't go anywhere or do anything. I just would take the time off to write. I would write on the weekends. But it was a slow process. I have to say, I stepped down as the director of the Ali Forney Center about halfway through the writing process, maybe a little bit more than halfway through the writing process. That, sped it up a lot. And I also think it was liberating. I think it's hard to write vulnerably and honestly about the hard parts of the work or the ambiguous parts of the work when you're in charge of the work. And I'm, it would have been hard to write the book that I've written if I was still in charge. I think that it would have censored my voice a little bit.
So the book begins with the memorial service for Ali, 1997. And as I was reading the book, I kept having to remind myself, the immediacy of the book is such that I had to remind myself, wait a minute, Ali has been dead for 27 years? I'm doing the math right? 1997?
Let's see, 07, 17, 24, yeah, 27
so
years.
In other words, it feels immediate. How old was Ali when they died?
I met Ali in 94, and they were 19 at that time, and they were killed in 97 when they were 22.
So I'm partly reflecting on my experience as the reader, but partly on the power of the experience that you've been through, that whatever effect Ali had on you is sufficiently powerful that 27 years later, you're writing about it like it was yesterday. I mean, with retrospective insight for sure, but that, and that's familiar to me from my own experience in reading writings about holy figures and such, that somehow that span of time collapses through memory or through the writing. Does it feel like a long time for you? 27 years.
When Ali had been dead for 22 years, I got upset.
Longer than
suddenly
being
Ali
alive.
was dead for longer than Ali had been alive. That was very disturbing to me somehow. It's a strange experience. I think that there are times in our life that we experience so intensely that they still are present to us. The time that I spent with Ali dealing with one young person after another being murdered, planning their memorial services, the kind of brutalization that I saw young people go through at that time. There's a certain sense in which it was profoundly traumatic, and I think that maybe I have some post-PTSD about it, and I think that when you have PTSD, you're sort of always stuck in that moment. So yeah, I feel very, that subway ride feels as vivid and as present to me as my ride to, probably more so than my ride to come to this event tonight. It's just, like a central pivotal part of my life.
Just to circle back to Dorothy Day for a moment, this Catholic worker foundress, her career, which lasted from, let's say, the moment I'm about to describe in 1906, I guess, until 1980, about breaking down the barriers between self and other, began with the San Francisco earthquake. She saw in the earthquake, people acting like brothers and sisters who were not related, the human community acting like a family. And she thought, well, why did it take an earthquake to make us to do that and act that way? And the rest of her life was an answer to that question. And I'm hearing something like that in what you're saying, that the combination of the sense of connection that you felt on the train and the sense of trauma you felt over Ali's murder has put you in this position of witness that that we're now able to enter into through this book. What do you think?
I actually wrote about Dorothy in the earthquake when I was writing about our drop-in center getting destroyed by Hurricane Sandy. But my editors cut it out. Actually, I think I was looking at your book as my guidance
it's
for
the
that.
opening scene of my first book is this earthquake that strikes San Francisco and a 8-year-old girl having her life changed by the experience. So you're daily responding to this double effect, the trauma and connection, and I can feel that in the book for sure. How alive it is for you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. What was your question again?
Is it accurate for me to say, and this is a kind of in summation or as we close, that you've lived your life in response to a couple of seismic events, the murder of Ali, but before that, the sense of connection with the people you serve on the train. It's alive to you so powerfully that you've been able to put it into this book so that it feels to me, and not just to you, like it was yesterday and not 27 years ago.
Well, one always wants to write vividly, I suppose. So if you feel I did, I'm grateful. Yeah, it's all very vivid to me. Ali was somebody that I really admired, really cared about. I mean, when you do this work, you want to offer everyone the same degree of concern and caring. But we're human, and there are people that touch us more than others. And I'm sure that all of us who've done this work, like there might be 2 or 3 people that have just really gotten into your heart. Ali was somebody that just really got into my heart. But not only that, something that I deal with in the book is that Ali really cared about me, for whatever reason. And I don't know that I have a very clear answer to what that was, what provoked that. But Ali loved me, and I loved Ali, not in a romantic way, not like that, but there's a real love that can happen when you are doing this work and you're with these young people. And, I think for young people that maybe have been abandoned and haven't been allowed to be themselves in almost any zone in their lives, to be in a space where they're allowed to be themselves, to see me as the leader of that program, kind of safeguarding that experience for them. It meant a lot to Ali. My favorite saint is Saint Therese of Lisieux. And she has this idea about God, that God loves us so much that God can't resist our love. Like our love draws God to us. And that was one of the real mysteries for me in this book. It was like Ali's love, Ali's goodness, Ali's caring for me, like sort of compelled me to do the work. That there was this moment in that I write about in the book, where, you know, after Ali was murdered, I had at that program Safe Space, I'd built up housing there, and had expanded the programming, and the program ended up getting destroyed by the executive director's corruption. They committed fraud, stole millions of dollars that I'd raised for homeless kids, and I don't really know what they did with it, but it sure didn't come to my kids. I was devastated and demoralized by that, and wanted to just stop doing the work. Like, I was just like, I poured my whole heart and soul into building this after Ali died, and then, you know, it got ravaged and ransacked. It was just this knowledge of Ali's love that just compelled me to do the work. Like, I felt like I didn't even have a choice. And I feel like, you know, it was like my ability to participate in some kind of divine process where, you know, love draws us to love. I don't know if I'm explaining this in a way that makes sense to anybody, but it's bizarre. Right? Like, I carry a lot of trauma from the loss of Ali and the other youth, but I also feel just profoundly fortunate that Ali and I had the relationship that we did, and that it bore fruit in what it did. I mean, you know, probably 15,000 young people have lived at the Ali Forney Center and have had, you know, an acceptance and an affirmation and a safety and a decency and a dignity that Ali was never able to have. You know, so I'm deeply, profoundly grateful that something in that connection and that love bore fruit in the way that it did.
15,000 people. What will remain of us is love. That's Philip Larkin. And definitely Ali's love remains in the work you've done and in this book. Thank you so much. There's books for sale and for signing outside, and we can continue the conversation over the signing. And thank you for our hosts. Thank you for everyone who has come, and thank you so much, Carl, for opening up in the way that you have in the past hour. I'm really grateful.
Well, thank you, Paul, for your kind, thoughtful, and probing questions. And thank you to the New York Public Library for welcoming me into a cathedral of literature.